Okay. So let me share my screen. Okay. Good morning. So we were talking about yesterday. Is doing a mitzvah with your friend's item, and we said that bisman hazeh, where svarim, where books are so inexpensive to produce, you can assume that someone is happy for you to borrow their book. But even with that, you cannot take it out of their home. Okay, so here's where we are over here. We also said yesterday that you're only allowed to borrow something of your friend when you know for sure he doesn't mind, when it's something that does not get consumed through use, let's say like food. But if it's something that gets consumed through use, like food, even if you know he wouldn't mind, but if he hasn't given you express permission, so then you're not allowed to take. So if you go to your friend's house and you're just waiting there, you shouldn't start noshing on the snacks, because your host has not given you permission yet. Or we said, if you know for sure that he's not going to mind, o shuhu davar she'ein, she'ein derech kol b'nei adam lahakpid alav klal, or people don't mind at all. Generally, when people use this item, because it's there's no loss at all. There's no concern about loss at all by using it in the way that you're using it. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. He says that's when, let's say you come to your friend's house and there's something that, let's say he's got a foosball table. Okay, so you can assume, I think you can assume, that he's okay with you playing with his foosball table. No? What do you think? There's no chashash, there's no concern of kilkul, of something getting spoiled or damaged. So I would think that would be in the realm of okay. But when it comes to something that was given to you for safekeeping, if someone asked you to watch an object for them, then some poskim say that even if it's something that people don't mind for you to use, if the owner did not give you express permission, the Torah has a special prohibition on a shomer being sholeach yad, using it for his own use. Then you're benefiting from it. Right. So the question is, why does the Torah prohibit shlichus yad? The Torah says, Im lo shalach yado bimlachet re'ehu, that you have to make sure that you don't send forth your hand to use your friend's item. He says, even when you want to use it for something that people would never mind, like that it wouldn't bother them at all. And the reason why they still say it's asur, ki isur shlichus yad, gzeras hakasuvu b'fikadon shehuvkad etzlo. He says, because it's a divine decree. Afilu b'davar shahayamuter lo im lo hayamuvkad etzlo. Even if this was a use that you'd be permitted to make you to do, if it wasn't given to you for safekeeping, ubal nefesh yachush l'divrehim kidleil simen daled sof seif chavches. He says, and that would be the proper conduct. And I refer you to the Imrei Yaakov over there as far as if someone gives you books for safekeeping. I don't remember exactly what we said over there. But if you want to take a look, Barry, because you have the safer in Siman Daled, At the end of Sif Chav Vav, if you want to just take a quick look, he says he referred to svarim that are given to a person for safekeeping. And while you're looking there, we'll just move a little bit forward. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Rav Shulchan Aruch. Actually, Sif. Yeah. Just does he say? Does the Rav Shulchan Aruch say something about svarim there? Yeah, well, the issue over there is if I lend you $100 and I ask you for collateral and you give me a stack of books as collateral, if I read those books, I'm getting not only my loan back, but I'm also getting added benefit of being able to read your books. So it is ribis. Any additional hana'ah that I get from you that's directly related to the loan is called ribis. No, the ribis can be even non-tangible. There's even a shaila in the poskim. Shaila in the poskim, are you allowed to say thank you when someone lends you money? Because you may. We paskin it's okay because it's a common courtesy. But the point is that you see how far it extends. In other words, you're not allowed to add anything to the payback in addition to the exact amount that you borrowed. So that's what he's talking about over there. Is that the end of the sif? So take a look at the Imrei Yaakov on Svarim. Does he say anything about Svarim? Okay. All right. Maybe I'll take a look when I get home. Okay. Now he says, "Vimhaya yodeya shezeh mishtamish b'chafetzav efshar shaya makbid v'nimtza zeh shol shalom midas haba olam v'hu gazlan." He says, even if you know that you won't ruin it all, you won't put any wear and tear on the item that you're borrowing. But if it is something that is you're borrowing without the knowledge of the owner, you're still a gazlan. Af she'eno mekalkel klal. Even though you're not wearing it down at all, you're not degrading it at all, you still are called a gazlan. Shol shalom midas haba says the Imrei Yaakov, mutter li shalom ibnei beiso shel balabayas devarim sherigilim olam lahashel l'shchenim u'makir. Someone had asked the question, can you borrow something from one of the kids in the house? If one of the kids gives you permission, is that okay? And he says, yes. That's as long as it's something that normally is lent out from neighbor to neighbor. Okay, that you are allowed to do. The kol shekain me ishto shel balabayas, and that's certainly true when you want to borrow something from the wife of the balabas. Va'ayin la'el simin dalet sif hey Imrei Yaakov. We learned all about those halachos about collect. I mentioned collecting tzedakah yesterday. Okay. Yeah, what is he saying? You're not allowed to go to your friend's house and read his farm without his knowledge. And we said, and we said today that this bisman hazeh, that halacha has changed because of the cost, the technology and the cost of printing. Okay, very good. Let's just take a look at a few of the Biurim. He says, you're not allowed to, we had said before, that you're not allowed to use or read from the book of your friend, whether it's his book or whether it's borrowed in his possession. You can't read that book unless you know that he's not makbid. So the Biurim says, Biur hatvarim kan. The harav ba lahashmienu. The gamim hadavar shaul biyado mikol makom asur lihishtamesh bo. He says, even if my friend has a book that he himself has borrowed from Yankel. So Shimon goes to Ruvain's house and he sees that Ruvain has borrowed a book and belongs to Yankel. He says, I'm still not allowed to read it. Because even though we see that Yankel is willing to lend his books to others and let others read his books, so he's demonstrated that he doesn't mind that people read his stuff. And he wants to share freely of his assets. And Shimon is not interested in taking it out of Reuven's house, just staying in Reuven's house and reading the book. Right? He says, and therefore you can't make the argument that we made before that you can't borrow something from a shoel because maybe the owner doesn't want it to be in someone else's possession. He just wants Reuven to have it. He doesn't want other people to have it. But you can't make that argument if Shimon is reading it in Reuven's home. As we explained before, that if someone has borrowed a book, he's allowed to let the members of his household read that. He says, but you're not allowed to read that book without permission of the person who borrowed the book. And the reason is because Reuven now becomes the controller. If we're not going to call him the owner, but he's the controller of that book. And so Shimon really has to ask Reuven, may I sit down and read this book? We learned before that if you go to the house of the Shoel, you're allowed to, let's say, read a book that Reuven has borrowed. But you have to ask Reuven permission. Ubizman hazeh nasa hashoel kiba'olim mamish le'inyan zeh shein adam acher shalish tamishimo b'li haskamaso. Dahavi kachol chayfetz acher shehu beveso shosh lish tamishimo d'shol shalom midas gazlanav. So therefore, it's no different from any other object that you find in your friend's house that you have to ask him permission before you utilize it, unless you know for sure it's something that he would want you to use. So we said that bizman hazeh, unless it's a rare antiquarian, book, you should feel free to read your friend's book, because it's fairly obvious that people don't mind if others read the books on their bookshelves, provided that it's not something under glass or it's not a rare first edition or something like that. Okay. I once was at someone's home. It was Mr. Schottenstein, who lives in Columbus, Ohio. And he had the Bomberg, the Bomberg Talmud that was printed for King Henry VIII. He had one volume of that Talmud in his home, and he took it out and he showed it to us, which is that's a pretty valuable book. Okay. No, I didn't touch it. Okay. Okay, now what happens if you end up borrowing something that you know that the owner won't mind? Okay, which we said is okay. If you know absolutely certain What happens? What happens if the object gets damaged? So I go to my friend's house. I find a book that I find fascinating. It's all about some medieval Jewish philosophical topic. I pull it off the shelf. I open it up. All of a sudden, the dog comes barking. He shocks me. I drop the book. The spine cracks. Disaster. Okay, so what's my liability at that point? So he says, it would seem to me, says Reb Stern, that you have to pay to get the book rebound, to compensate him. And you can't say that I'm put or replace the book. And you can't say I'm putter because it's mesa machmas malacha. That mesa machmas malacha is if anytime I borrow an animal, if it dies in the course of normal work, I'm putter, right? So this is normal reading. So why shouldn't I be putter? He says, because what's the reason that when an animal dies in the course of normal work that I'm putter? Ramban says as follows. He says, I'm not sure, we have to really, it's astounding to me. Is it any worse than if an animal just dies naturally? When an animal dies naturally, that's onus, and I'm going to be liable. He says, if an animal just dies while it's in the stable, I am liable. That's what's called the onus. The Malach HaMavis decided to take this animal's life. Umali hacha, umali hasam. So why should it be that if it's dying in the course of normal work, that I'm putter? So why should I be putter if when it was in my possession, it dies? He says, V'yesh lomar, so the Ramban explains, the shoel vade chayiv ba'onsin, avalo bipshia demashia. He says, the answer is that a borrower is liable for all mishaps that occur during the time he borrows it. But he's not liable for negligence of the owner of that animal. The Khan perish mesa machas malacha, mashal pashaba, shehishilo lemalacha v'ye'ena yecholo lispalosa. If you lend me your animal, and that animal I put to work in the standard work that this animal is designated for. I use a donkey and I put a normal load on the donkey's back, and all of a sudden I hear a snap and something breaks in the donkey and it just drops and dies. So who's responsible in that situation? That's the negligence of the owner of the donkey, because you took an animal that was not capable of doing the work that it was designated for, and you gave it to me. He says that's the argument. The argument is that if I use something in the normal course, which in the normal course of work it breaks, it means that it was never meant to be used for that. And if you ended up giving it to me knowing that I was going to use it for that purpose, then you, the owner, were negligent in not checking the item to see if it was durable enough to withstand that activity. So when you lend me a donkey, you know that donkeys are used for schlepping. And if that donkey was not capable of schlepping, then it was wrong for you to lend it to me for that purpose. That's the argument as to why even a shoel who's chayiv in onsin is going to be potter for mesa machmas malach.
Not a matter of the owner, it died in normal course.
Right, but the question that the Ramban is asking is like this: if the animal, let's say there's a natural disaster, there's a flash flood, and I'm your neighbor, okay, and you've got your donkey in your stable, and I say, can I borrow the donkey overnight? And I take it over to my stable, which is literally 100 feet from your stable. The flash flood comes and it kills the donkey. I could argue it would have died in your stable the same way it would have died in my stable. But what's the halacha? Shoel is chayet. Why? So the answer is because an act of God, the shoel takes responsibility for. So then why do we say Mesa Machmas Malacha? Yeah. So how do you, right? So that's where you come to this explanation. Is that why did you give me an animal that wasn't capable of doing what it was designated for? You knew I needed this animal to schlep. Why did you give me an animal that was going to die? Right? That's the distinction that we would have to draw. That's the svar.
So while it's schlepping, you're not responsible for it. As soon as it stops, if it dies then.
If it dies as an act of God, right? Basically from the Malach HaMavis, right? Because it was its time. So then I'm going to be liable.
So if it's walking along before you put the load on, you're liable. Once you put the load on, it fails because of that.
That's correct. That's correct. So that's the arguments that the Ramban gives, and he says, "V'chein kasav harashba v'aribash, im kein kan shelo pasha hamashil chayev hashoel ad kan lashona." He says, so in any situation where the owner of the item didn't do something negligent, like leaving out a book that was so fragile that it was inevitable that it was going to break by opening it, so then the shoel is going to be liable. So if I end up dropping the book by accident, you can't call that Mesa Machmas Malacha, because there was no negligence on behalf of the Bashiel, of the owner of the book. So I go ahead, I borrow my friend's object without his permission. Now, I'm not a goslin because it's a type of object that everyone is okay with. Or it would be abnormal for people to mind if I play with your football table. But if I do something, let's say I get the ball jammed in one of the football players and I end up tearing the velvet on the, whatever that's called, on the floor on the playing field. So was there any negligence on behalf of the owner? So that's it. The owner comes home and he says, oh, you gotta jig that, and because when you play with this thing is known to jam or something like that, right? So you got to jig it exactly like this in order for it to work. Shkoyach. Now you tell me. So that might be, you could call that a negligence of the owner, because if he gives you permission to use something like an appliance, a machine, and he knows that you got to jig it, and so it's just the right way, or and he didn't tell that to me, and then I ended up breaking it. As a result, it short-circuited or whatever it is. So then you can't hold the borrower liable. That's Mesa Machmas Malacha. But here, when I borrowed it without his permission and it was a football table or whatever, and I didn't do anything that was so crazy, or there was nothing that I should have known, but it ended up breaking, so then that's not called Mesa Machmas Malacha. He says, because there was no negligence on behalf of the owner. And we don't say that he shouldn't have lent it out because he knew that it could break without that disclosure.
That example you pulled out, reading the book and you don't, where did that happen? That happened.
It happened in the owner's house, the book owner's house.
That was the owner. One argued that was negligence to the dog for money, which then caused you to do it.
His friend was allergic to dogs, so that's
No, I don't think so, because who told? How was I supposed to know that when my little dog Sparky was going to come barking out, you were going to be reading one of my books and you drop it out of fright? That's how am I supposed to? How am I, as the owner, supposed to know that? And so how can you blame the owner? Oh, you shouldn't have let your dog Sparky out when I was reading your book. No one told you to read my book. That's right. That's right. Anyway, so he says, Mikol Makom, Im Nishbar Umeisa Machmas Malacha Bada Dilo Pasha Mashal. Okay, so all right, Shari Bemis Lo Yishilo Lo Behedja, because in this case, I didn't tell you to go ahead and borrow it. In other words, it's one thing if I told you, yeah, go ahead and read my books, and then I don't tell you that I'm releasing Sparky. Then maybe that's one argument that you could make is, I was so shocked by you releasing your little tiny Chihuahua that I was thrown totally off guard, and its bark was worse than its bite. He says, and therefore it would seem to me that if any mishap occurs, even when you're in the house of the shoel and you've borrowed it without his permission, but you did so justifiably because it's not something that people normally care about, so then, but it still breaks, you're going to be liable. Ulam Reisi ben Nesivos Mishpat, and he says that I see one commentary, the Nesivos, who says the cost of Shamal Hadisa Barama, the Shori Lakachas is Chamor Shechaver Lahatzil Shalo, the Tanai based in who. There's a special case halacha. Let's say my house is in the process of collapsing, and I need to save, and there's a flash flood, and the only way that I can save my property is by loading it up on your donkey. So normally I'm not allowed to borrow your donkey without permission. But in order to save my property, Chazal made a special exception to allow you to borrow your friend's property in order to save your own property. He says the Tanai based in who the Chazal basically made an allowance. The Kevin Shapaga Bohezek Pitom Hisnu based in Shirashus Biyado Likach Kalev Shel Chavero Ulahatzel Shalo Ayin Sham Bisma. Normally this would be considered to be Gezel, but the rabbis suspended the Gezel prohibition because since a person is so overtaken with emotion and shock when he sees that his property is about to be destroyed, the rabbis granted permission. And of course, you'll have to assume liability for anything that happens to the donkey, but you are allowed to borrow your friend's item without their permission in order to save your own property. Famous movie scene. You're being pursued by the hitman. And so you go and you see a motorcycle that just all of a sudden happens to start as soon as you turn it on, right? So you're allowed to save your life by borrowing someone's property, even though they didn't give you permission. Then usually you end up crashing the motorcycle, goes up in flames, but whatever, that we won't talk about that now. Because of Alzehan Asibas Amishpat, the Kanira, the Afilu Imesa Machmas Malacha Pater, the Kevin Titnai based in who Habale Kesocher Midas, the Pater B'Mesa Machmas Malacha Ad Kandavara. And the Nesiva says something surprising. He says that if I end up borrowing my friend's donkey to save my property, and it ends up dying in the normal course of work, I'm going to be pater. And he says so Rav Stern says, of alichora devar ve'elu tzarech iyan. Latam hanal shel harishonim depater demesa machmas malachim mishum damashul pashabo im kain kan shebemes lo hishilo midaitu madu and nifter l'shol arimashul lo pasha bazeh. He says, and that's what he ends up with at tzarech iyan. I don't understand why the Nesivos would let the shoel off the hook. You borrowed it without my permission. Maybe it's true that the donkey is a weak donkey and it's not able to withstand that. And if I had lent it to you with the intent of having you load it, then you would be pater if it died because I was negligent by not disclosing that to you. But here you borrowed it without my permission. You went into my stable, you took my donkey. There was no way for me as the owner to be considered negligent in that by not disclosing to you that the donkey was old and it can't schlep. So why should you be putter? So why should you be putter? Because I didn't do anything wrong, the owner. So that's where Rav Stern ends off with its Sarachian, and this is where we'll hold it for today. We don't have a resolution for this dilemma. Why? It would seem not like the Nesivus. It would seem that in that case, the Shoel should be liable if it's Mesa Mach Masmala. Okay, we'll hold it here.